Well, hello and welcome to the next video in this series that talks about the cool and unique features of the Nikon CoolPix P950. Now, this is a picture that you've seen before in one of the earlier videos. I spoke about this picture, and the reason why we're looking at this picture again is that I wanted to highlight something I've mentioned in passing in other videos about how the P950 does very well taking pictures of either green subjects that are green in color, or having a green background. And I used the bird watching feature when I took the picture of this dragonfly, and I was able to zoom right in. I had no problems getting the P950 to autofocus. Notice something here. The shutter speed 1/500, and the aperture 5.6 the opening, and then we have the ISO right here, which is 400. Now, for those of you who are not very fluent in photography or maybe just beginning, the ISO comes from the days when we used to use film, like literal film inside your camera, like a roll of film. And so basically what the ISO is the sensitivity of the film. Back in the day, you would use a specific type of film based on the type of pictures that you were going to take. If you were going to take pictures in low light conditions, then you would use a film with a high ISO, 800 or higher. And if you're going to take pictures in bright conditions, then you would use like something like a 250, 200. But usually 400 is like middle of the park. So that's the average, and that's a good middle ground, and that's the type of film that I used to use in my Minolta film camera. Having explained what ISO is, it's basically the sensitivity of the film. However, these digital cameras do not use film, so the ISO is gonna change the sensitivity of the electronic sensor inside your camera. So usually for dark situations, where there's very little light, your camera will automatically go to a higher ISO just to compensate for that low light. So the sensor becomes more sensitive, and when the sun is very bright, we'll see the ISO go down. The photographer must take into consideration ISO, shutter speed, and the aperture opening in the camera's lens. Because we're using a point and shoot camera in automatic mode, we don't have to think about that. The engineers at Nikon, they already figured that out, and they put their algorithm in to make decisions. So 90% of the time we don't have to think about that. We just let the camera's computer do the job. And let's jump to the next picture. So if you notice, the shutter speed changed from here with the dragonfly. It was at 1/500, which is basically 500ths of a second. And from that, it jumped to this 1/100th of a second. So what's happening here in this picture is that it has there's this beautiful green canopy formed by the branches on the trees. And by pointing the camera up towards the sky, I basically had a lot of light. It was not direct sunlight, but I still had light coming into the camera's lens. So the camera said, you know what? I'm going to open the aperture wider, but I'm going to get the shutter speed slow enough so that I can get this picture exposed properly. And this was a very good trade-off from what I can see. The ISO was 400, and the shutter speed was relatively slow, but not too slow that it would blur the picture, and the exposure was just right, and this gave me a very beautiful picture. But I think the computer or the algorithm inside the P950 does very well against green backgrounds, because oftentimes when I take picture and the background isn't green, then it has a problem focusing, or it's just off, it's too dark. Those are the issues that I come across when taking those pictures. But with a green background, I have absolutely no problems. Now this picture was a bit harder. Notice how the ISO has jumped up to 560, obviously because this baby owl is inside a shadow of a tree. So the lighting has gone down a lot. And then not only did the camera move the ISO up to 560, the shutter speed also went way down to 1/60th of a second. So just a slower shutter speed to allow the image to be saved and retained on the sensor. And truth be told, I took many pictures of this baby owl, but this was the only one that came out perfect. So I think what was happening is that the camera was struggling to just get the right focus and get the right exposure, because the other pictures I took where the focus was good, but the exposure was off. So no doubt the computer, the processor inside this camera is working hard behind the scenes to get the picture just right. And one of the things I'm going to recommend to those of you who would like to take pictures like this, use a tripod. In my previous video in the series, I spoke about using a tripod. Use a tripod to steady the camera, or even the monopod. Use that to steady the camera so that you can get the subject in the center of the frame, or with that green rectangle square on the subject, and then press the shutter release slightly, but don't press it all the way down. Just press it so that the camera can analyze the environment and determine the correct lighting. And then once you see in the frame that it's properly lit and it looks good, then you press it all the way down and you can take that picture. Because if you press it too quickly, then the camera will not have the time to measure the amount of light and analyze the color and then set all these parameters correctly. In this situation, this was a relatively dark photo. There's so much happening around. The ISO is at 400 and the shutter speed is all the way down. However, what I had to do in this photo of this blue jay, because of the darkness around, this bird was basically almost hidden between the branches. I had to get the right angle, and even then you can see that there are a few branches that are hiding parts of this bird. What I had to do was set the camera to manual focus because it had such a hard time figuring out whether I was trying to take a picture of this branch, this, all these other things. So when you have many things in the frame and there isn't an obvious contrast, the camera is not sure what you want to focus on. So that's why I had to do the manual focus in this picture. But let's watch a video to see how you do a manual focus in a situation like this where the P950 is having a hard time focusing on the specific subject that you have chosen. So the CoolPix P950, in my opinion, it does very well when you're taking a picture of wildlife like a bird out in the open in very bright sunlight, or where there is a huge contrast between the color of the bird and the background. However, it gets a bit more difficult when you're recording a bird or some other animal in a dark spot like we're seeing right now, and the contrast isn't very great. So here you can see we're in bird shooting mode, and oftentimes what will happen is that the contrast isn't great. Using the autofocus, it might lock on to the leaves, for example, because I noticed with this camera there's a tendency, or in other words, it seems to like anything that's green, especially if it's a bright green. And so it will often lock onto the leaves when in fact you're trying to take a picture of a bird. So to solve that problem, what you could do, you could just flip this knob to manual focus. Once you flip it to manual focus, you see this information right here? So the left arrow changes the focus speed and the right arrow is autofocus. So what you do is that you hit the right arrow to do the autofocus, but if it's still not focused, what you can do is just turn this wheel, and you can see this going up and down right here. That's showing you that the focus is changing. Now right now it's at X4 as shown right here, and what that means is that the focus is gonna change relatively fast. You see that? So you turn the wheel and the focus changes relatively fast. But if you were to press the left arrow, you see it goes to X1, so the focus speed is much slower. And basically what you can do is just use that to fine-tune. Make sure you're getting the picture of the correct subject and that the camera's autofocus isn't locking on to the wrong subject. And basically that is how I get some of the more difficult pictures where the camera just is not intelligent enough to lock on to what I'm aiming at.